Nobody expected Leanne Morgan's appearance on Watch What Happens Live to become one of the most talked-about interviews of the year. What was supposed to be a lighthearted night filled with jokes, laughter, and playful celebrity banter allegedly took a dramatic turn when a conversation with Cohen became increasingly tense. By the end of the night, viewers were left asking the same question. How did an interview that began with smiles end with Leanne walking away from the set? Cohen has built his reputation on asking the questions that other hosts won't. For years, he's been known for pushing guests just far enough to get the reaction everyone is waiting for. Sometimes it's a surprising confession. Sometimes it's an emotional outburst. And sometimes it's the kind of awkward silence that becomes headline news the next morning. It's a formula that has defined his career and made his clubhouse one of the most unpredictable places on television. But every formula has a breaking point. Leanne Morgan didn't arrive looking for an argument. She wasn't promoting controversy or trying to settle old scores. She came with the same warm Southern charm and down-to-earth personality that helped turn her from a stand-up comedian performing in small venues into one of the biggest names in comedy. Fans expected funny stories, heartfelt moments, and the easygoing humor that has become her trademark. Instead, the mood slowly began to change. What started as harmless conversation reportedly shifted into something much more personal. Questions became sharper. The jokes felt less playful. Every answer seemed to invite an even tougher follow-up. At first, Leanne responded with patience and grace, refusing to let the atmosphere affect her. But as the interview continued, it became increasingly clear that the discussion was heading somewhere neither the audience nor the guest had expected. The surprising part wasn't that difficult questions were asked. Cohen has never been afraid of uncomfortable conversations. The real surprise was how Leanne handled the pressure. Rather than losing her temper or creating the explosive television moment many people anticipated, she remained calm, measured, and remarkably composed. And in doing so, she gradually shifted the energy of the entire room. As the tension continued to build, the balance of control appeared to change. The interview no longer felt like a playful exchange between host and guest. It felt like two very different approaches to public conversation colliding in real time. One side continued pushing for more. The other refused to abandon its principles, no matter how uncomfortable the questions became. Then came the moment that allegedly changed everything. A final exchange pushed the conversation beyond ordinary celebrity banter and into something far more serious. Within moments, what had begun as a routine promotional appearance was said to have become one of the most uncomfortable moments the show had ever experienced. So what exactly happened between Leanne Morgan and Cohen? How did an evening that promised laughs reportedly end with a dramatic walk-off? And why has this story sparked so much debate among viewers? Let's start from the very beginning. The atmosphere inside Watch What Happens Live looked exactly the way longtime viewers had come to expect. Bright lights filled the studio, the audience was energized, and everything about the set was designed to feel relaxed, spontaneous, and unpredictable. It was the kind of environment where celebrities often let their guard down, trading polished interviews for playful conversations that could head in almost any direction. That night's guests seemed like the perfect match for that format. Leanne Morgan had built her career on being relatable. Long before sold-out comedy tours and streaming specials introduced her to millions of viewers, she had earned a loyal following simply by telling honest, everyday stories about family, marriage, motherhood, and the awkward moments everyone experiences, but rarely talks about. Her comedy wasn't driven by scandal or celebrity feuds. Instead, audiences connected with the warmth, humility, and authenticity she brought to every performance. That reputation followed her everywhere she went. Fans didn't tune in expecting controversy. They expected laughter. They expected the same charming storyteller who could turn an ordinary trip to the grocery store into a hilarious 10-minute routine. If anyone seemed unlikely to become involved in a heated television confrontation, it was Leanne Morgan. Cohen, meanwhile, entered the interview with the confidence of someone who had spent years guiding unpredictable conversations. Few television hosts have interviewed as many outspoken personalities or navigated as many uncomfortable moments. Whether the guest was a reality television star, an actor, or a comedian, Andy had developed a reputation for asking the questions that others avoided. His style relied on keeping guests slightly off balance, encouraging unexpected answers that audiences would remember long after the episode ended. On paper, the pairing made perfect sense. One guest was known for kindness and relatable humor. The other was known for quick wit and fearless interviewing. Together, it seemed like the ingredients for an entertaining, easygoing conversation. There was no reason to expect anything different. As the interview began, both appeared comfortable. Leanne smiled easily, joked with the audience, and settled into the conversation with the same relaxed energy that had made her such a beloved performer. Andy welcomed her with his trademark confidence, guiding the discussion through lighthearted topics while keeping the pace lively. For several minutes, everything unfolded exactly as viewers had anticipated. The audience laughed at Leanne's stories. Andy responded with playful comments. The chemistry between host and guest appeared effortless. Nothing about those opening moments hinted that the evening would eventually take such an unexpected turn. But beneath the friendly conversation, subtle changes were already beginning to emerge. The questions became just a little more personal. The pauses between answers grew slightly longer. What initially felt like harmless curiosity slowly started carrying a different tone. Neither the audience nor the viewers at home could have known it yet, but the interview was quietly moving away from comedy and toward confrontation. And once that shift began, there would be no easy way to bring the conversation back. The opening stretch of the interview unfolded exactly the way everyone in the studio had hoped it would. The conversation was relaxed, the jokes landed naturally, and Leanne Morgan quickly settled into the kind of easy rhythm that had made her one of the most beloved comedians in America. There was no sign of tension, no awkward pauses, and certainly no indication that the night would become the center of heated discussion. Leanne greeted the audience with the same down-to-earth personality her fans had come to love. Rather than trying to impress anyone, she simply leaned into the stories and observations that had built her career. She laughed at herself, joked about everyday life, and answered questions with the warmth that had become her trademark. It didn't take long for the audience to respond. Every punchline earned genuine laughter, and every story seemed to strengthen the connection she was building with the room. Andy Cohen appeared equally comfortable. He kept the conversation moving with lighthearted questions about Leanne's recent success, her growing fan base, and the excitement surrounding her latest projects. His tone was playful, and for a while, the interview felt less like a formal television appearance and more like two entertainers enjoying a friendly conversation. As the minutes passed, Leanne continued to win people over. Instead of delivering rehearsed promotional answers, she spoke naturally, often turning simple questions into humorous stories that reflected her unique perspective on family, relationships, and everyday experiences. Her ability to make ordinary situations feel extraordinary reminded everyone why audiences had embraced her comedy in the first place. The crowd was fully invested. Each laugh seemed louder than the last, and the atmosphere inside the studio felt increasingly relaxed. Even viewers unfamiliar with Leanne could understand why her popularity had grown so rapidly. She wasn't trying to dominate the room. She simply had a way of making people feel comfortable, as though they were listening to someone they had known for years. For Andy, everything appeared to be unfolding according to plan. The interview had energy, the audience was engaged, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. On the surface, it looked like another successful episode built around a charismatic guest. But experienced interviewers often know that the most revealing moments don't happen at the beginning of a conversation. They happen after everyone has relaxed. Almost unnoticed, the rhythm of the interview began to change. The playful jokes became less frequent. Andy's questions grew slightly more direct, testing the boundaries between light entertainment and personal conversation. The shift was subtle enough that many viewers probably didn't recognize it immediately, but the atmosphere inside the studio was no longer exactly the same. Leanne's smile never disappeared, and her composure remained steady. Yet her answers became more thoughtful, as though she sensed the discussion was moving into unfamiliar territory. She still responded with humor, but there was now a hint of caution beneath her easygoing delivery. It was a small change, one that could easily have been overlooked. But looking back, it marked the beginning of everything that followed. The easy laughter that had defined the opening minutes was slowly giving way to something else. The interview was no longer just about promoting a career or sharing funny stories. It was beginning to feel like a test, and neither the audience nor the viewers at home yet realized how dramatically the tone was about to change. By the time the conversation reached its next phase, the atmosphere had changed in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. The laughter was still there, but it came less often. The easy back and forth that had defined the opening minutes began giving way to longer pauses, more carefully chosen words, and questions that seemed designed to dig beneath the surface. Andy Cohen had built his reputation on knowing exactly when to make that shift. For years, viewers had watched him steer interviews away from safe, predictable topics and into conversations that revealed something more personal. It was part of what made his show so successful. Guests often arrived expecting a casual interview, only to find themselves answering questions they hadn't anticipated. Sometimes those moments produced surprising honesty. Other times, they created headlines that dominated entertainment news for days. This time, however, the dynamic felt different. Instead of staying focused on Leanne's work and recent success, the questions reportedly became more personal. Andy began exploring the contrast between Leanne's public image and the person behind it, suggesting that audiences often wondered whether someone could truly be as kind and approachable as she appeared on stage. Leanne didn't seem offended. At least, not at first. She answered with the same calm confidence that had carried her through the rest of the interview. Rather than becoming defensive, she explained that the version of herself people saw in public wasn't an act or a carefully crafted character. It was simply the result of treating people with the same respect she expected in return. For a moment, it looked as though the conversation might settle there. But Andy wasn't ready to move on. Instead of accepting her explanation, he followed up with another question. Then another. Each one seemed slightly more direct than the last, challenging whether maintaining such a consistently positive image required careful planning rather than genuine personality. The audience began reacting differently. Earlier, every exchange had been met with laughter. Now the reactions were more uncertain. Some people chuckled nervously, while others simply waited to see where the conversation was heading. It was becoming clear that the interview was drifting away from playful entertainment and into territory that felt far more personal. Leanne remained remarkably composed. She never raised her voice or showed visible frustration. Instead, she responded thoughtfully, choosing her words with care. She acknowledged that building a successful career certainly required hard work and discipline, but she rejected the idea that kindness itself had to be manufactured or performed. Her answers were simple, direct, and sincere. Ironically, the calmer she remained, the more the tension seemed to grow. Andy appeared determined to uncover a different side of his guest, continuing to search for the kind of revealing moment that often defines memorable celebrity interviews. But with every question, Leanne refused to abandon the calm, respectful approach that had shaped both her career and her reputation. The contrast between the two personalities became impossible to miss. One continued pressing for a deeper reaction. The other refused to be pulled into conflict. By now, the audience wasn't just listening to an interview anymore. They were watching two completely different philosophies collide in real time. One believed that persistence eventually uncovered the truth. The other believed that honesty didn't require confrontation. Neither side was backing away. And although no one could know it yet, the conversation was only one question away from reaching a point where the entire tone of the evening would change for good. As the interview continued, it became increasingly clear that neither Andy Cohen nor Leanne Morgan was willing to change course. What had started as a friendly exchange had slowly transformed into something far more serious. The smiles were still there, but they no longer carried the same easy warmth they had at the beginning of the night. Every question seemed heavier than the last, and every answer carried a little more weight. Andy appeared determined to get beyond the carefully composed public image that millions of people associated with Leanne. Throughout his career, he'd often suggested that the most interesting conversations happen when guests stop giving polished answers and begin speaking from raw emotion. Whether that approach was fair or not, it had become part of his interviewing style, and many viewers expected him to push until he found that defining moment. So he kept pressing. Instead of returning to lighter topics, the discussion reportedly focused on whether Leanne's wholesome reputation reflected who she truly was, or whether it had become part of a carefully managed public persona. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Success at Leanne's level, Andy suggested, rarely happened by accident. Surely there had to be another side of her that audiences never got to see. Leanne listened without interrupting. When it was her turn to respond, she didn't answer with anger or sarcasm. She simply explained that kindness wasn't something she switched on when cameras started rolling. It wasn't a marketing strategy or a character she stepped into for interviews. According to her, Treating people with respect was a personal choice she made long before television audiences knew her name. Her response was calm, almost disarmingly calm. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the conversation might finally move in another direction. But instead of letting the point stand, Andy reportedly challenged it again from a different angle. If someone managed to stay positive through years of success, criticism, and public attention, wasn't that proof of careful image management rather than pure authenticity? The room grew noticeably quieter. Audience members who had spent the first half of the interview laughing now found themselves listening with complete attention. The energy had shifted so gradually that few people could pinpoint exactly when it happened, but everyone could feel it now. This was no longer ordinary celebrity banter. It had become a debate over character, perception, and authenticity. Leanne remained composed. She acknowledged that every public figure makes decisions about what parts of their life to share. That's simply part of living in the spotlight. But she pushed back against the idea that choosing privacy automatically meant someone was hiding their true personality. In her view, protecting certain parts of life wasn't deception, it was balance. The audience seemed to appreciate that perspective. A few nodded. Others quietly applauded before the applause quickly faded. It wasn't the loud, celebratory reaction from earlier in the show. It was something more thoughtful, as though people were weighing both sides of the conversation for themselves. Andy, however, didn't appear satisfied. Rather than accepting Leanne's explanation, he continued searching for a contradiction. He reportedly asked whether there had ever been moments when she lost her temper, regretted something she had said, or simply showed a side of herself that audiences never expected. The question itself wasn't unusual, but after everything that had already been discussed, it landed differently. Leanne paused before answering, not because she seemed caught off guard, but because she appeared to be choosing her words with extraordinary care. She explained that, like anyone else, she had difficult days, made mistakes, and experienced frustration. The difference, she said, was that she didn't believe every emotion needed to become public entertainment. That response changed the atmosphere once again. Instead of giving Andy the dramatic moment he seemed to be searching for, Leanne redirected the conversation towards something larger. She questioned whether modern interviews had become so focused on exposing flaws that simple decency now seemed suspicious. Why, she wondered, had kindness become something people felt compelled to investigate instead of simply accepting? For the first time that evening, it felt as though control of the conversation was beginning to shift. Andy was still asking the questions, but Leanne was shaping what those questions actually meant. The interview was no longer about discovering hidden secrets. It had become a discussion about the expectations placed on public figures and whether audiences had started believing that authenticity could only exist alongside conflict. The tension inside the studio became almost impossible to ignore. No one laughed. No one interrupted. Everyone seemed to realize they were witnessing something that had moved well beyond the lighthearted format the evening had promised. And although both host and guest remained outwardly composed, the next exchange would bring the conversation to a turning point from which there would be no easy return. By this point, the conversation had reached a place neither side seemed able or willing to leave behind. The easy rhythm that had carried the opening of the interview was gone. Every exchange now carried a sense of anticipation, as if everyone in the room understood that one more question could completely change the direction of the night. Andy didn't back away. Instead, he reportedly leaned further into the discussion, returning once again to the subject of authenticity. Rather than moving on to a safer topic, he suggested that audiences are often fascinated by the gap between a celebrity's public image and their private reality. It wasn't presented as an accusation, but it was clear he was still searching for something beneath the surface. Leanne listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't respond with visible frustration. Instead, she waited until Andy had finished speaking before answering in the same calm, measured tone that had defined her throughout the evening. She explained that there was nothing wrong with asking thoughtful questions. Public figures understand that curiosity comes with the spotlight. But she believed there was an important difference between trying to understand someone and trying to prove that they weren't who they claimed to be. That distinction, she suggested, mattered. For the first time all evening, the conversation shifted away from individual questions and toward the interview itself. Rather than simply responding, Leanne began reflecting on the direction the discussion had taken. She wondered aloud why the focus seemed to have moved from celebrating success and sharing stories to repeatedly questioning whether kindness could possibly be genuine. The audience grew noticeably quieter. Earlier, viewers had reacted almost instantly to every joke and every punchline. Now, many simply watched in silence, waiting to hear what would be said next. Even the smallest pause seemed to last longer than before. Andy responded by defending his approach. He reportedly explained that asking difficult questions was part of his job. Viewers expected honest conversations, and honest conversations sometimes required uncomfortable topics. In his view, challenging guests wasn't about creating conflict for its own sake. It was about moving beyond rehearsed answers and discovering something real. Leanne nodded respectfully before replying. She acknowledged that meaningful interviews often required difficult questions. She didn't disagree with that idea. What concerned her, however, was the assumption that authenticity could only be discovered by questioning someone's character over and over again. She posed a simple thought. If a guest answered honestly the first time, why should honesty become more believable only after repeated pressure? The room fell silent. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of an argument spiraling out of control. It was the kind of silence that follows a question people genuinely begin thinking about. For several seconds, there was no laughter, no applause, and no attempt to interrupt. The conversation had changed. It was no longer about one celebrity interview. It had become a broader discussion about trust, perception, and the way public personalities are often expected to defend qualities that would normally be considered strengths. Andy attempted to steer the interview back toward lighter ground, reportedly suggesting that viewers simply enjoyed seeing different sides of their favorite celebrities. But by then, the tone had already shifted too far. Leanne remained composed, but her words carried greater conviction than before. She explained that there was nothing wrong with showing different sides of one's personality. Everyone has moments of joy, frustration, disappointment, and excitement. The problem, she suggested, was expecting every conversation to uncover conflict simply because conflict attracts attention. Her response resonated. Some audience members quietly nodded in agreement. Others remained expressionless, unsure of where the discussion would go next. The playful atmosphere that had defined the beginning of the night had been replaced by something far more reflective. Without raising her voice or displaying anger, Leanne had subtly changed the balance of the interview. Andy was still leading the conversation, but he no longer seemed to control its direction. For the first time that evening, it felt as though the host was responding to the guest instead of the other way around. The shift was gradual, almost invisible, but impossible to ignore once it happened. And with emotions now running just beneath the surface, the interview stood on the edge of its most dramatic moment. One final exchange would determine whether the conversation could still be recovered, or whether it was about to reach a point of no return. The turning point had come and gone. By now, it wasn't just another celebrity interview. The entire atmosphere inside the studio had changed. The conversation was no longer following the usual rhythm of playful questions and quick jokes. Instead, every sentence carried a level of seriousness that neither the audience nor the viewers at home had expected when the interview first began. What surprised people most wasn't that Leanne Morgan disagreed with Andy Cohen. It was the way she chose to do it. She never interrupted him. She never raised her voice. She never tried to match confrontation with confrontation. Instead, she calmly took control of the conversation, simply by refusing to abandon the tone she had maintained from the very beginning. After another pointed question about her public image, Leanne reportedly paused for a moment before answering. Rather than defending herself again, she turned the focus toward the interview itself. She explained that there was a difference between asking difficult questions out of genuine curiosity and asking them with the expectation that eventually someone would break under the pressure. That observation immediately changed the energy in the room. For the first time all evening, Andy wasn't simply leading the discussion. He found himself responding to Leanne's perspective instead. She continued by explaining that every public figure understands criticism. No one who chooses a career in entertainment expects universal praise. Audiences have opinions, journalists ask difficult questions, and interviews don't always go as planned. That's part of the profession. But repeatedly questioning whether someone's kindness is real, she suggested, sends a very different message. It implies that decency itself has become suspicious. Leanne reportedly explained that people often assume success must come with hidden motives. If someone is polite, they're pretending. If someone avoids conflict, they're hiding something. If someone refuses to speak negatively about others, they're accused of protecting a carefully managed image. She questioned that way of thinking. Why, she wondered, had honesty become less believable than controversy? Why had kindness become something that required proof? Those questions hung in the air. No one rushed to answer them. The audience, which had spent most of the evening laughing, now listened in complete silence. The room had become remarkably still, not because anyone was uncomfortable, but because the conversation had shifted into territory that felt unexpectedly meaningful. Andy reportedly defended his interviewing style once again, explaining that viewers wanted authenticity and that his role as a host was to ask the questions others might avoid. It was an argument many longtime fans had heard before. Leanne acknowledged that point. She agreed that honest conversations matter. She agreed that challenging questions have their place. But then she offered a different perspective. She explained that authenticity doesn't always reveal itself through conflict. Sometimes the most honest answer is the first one someone gives. Continuing to push after that, she suggested, risks turning a conversation into an attempt to manufacture a moment rather than understand a person. That distinction resonated with the audience. It wasn't delivered as an accusation. It wasn't spoken with anger. It was presented calmly, thoughtfully, and with enough confidence that it became difficult to dismiss. As the exchange continued, it became increasingly apparent that Leanne was no longer simply answering questions. She was redefining the entire discussion. The interview had shifted away from whether her public image was genuine and toward a broader conversation about how modern entertainment often rewards conflict over sincerity. Andy appeared determined to regain control of the interview, but every attempt to redirect the conversation seemed to bring them back to the same central issue. Leanne wasn't refusing to answer. She wasn't avoiding difficult topics. She was questioning the assumptions behind the questions themselves. That subtle difference changed everything. For several moments, neither side seemed interested in winning an argument. Instead, they were defending two completely different philosophies. One believed that persistence uncovered the truth. The other believed that respect made honest conversations possible in the first place. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Without shouting, without dramatic gestures, without a single emotional outburst, Leanne had become the steady center of a conversation that was growing more intense with every passing minute. And although she remained composed on the outside, it was becoming increasingly clear that her patience was nearing its limit. The next exchange wouldn't simply continue the debate. It would force a decision about whether the interview could still move forward, or whether the evening had reached a point where walking away seemed like the only option. By now, the discussion had moved far beyond anything either the audience or the viewers at home could have anticipated. The playful atmosphere that had filled the opening minutes of the interview had completely disappeared, replaced by a conversation that felt unusually personal and unexpectedly reflective. What made the moment so striking wasn't loud voices or dramatic gestures. It was restraint. Leanne Morgan remained remarkably calm, even as the questions reportedly continued to challenge the authenticity of the image she had spent years building. She wasn't trying to score points or embarrass anyone. Instead, she seemed determined to explain something she believed had been misunderstood from the very beginning. She took a brief pause before speaking again. When she did, her voice reportedly carried the same warmth that had defined her comedy for years, but now there was unmistakable conviction behind every word. Leanne explained that people often mistake kindness for weakness. In today's world, she suggested, many assume that if someone consistently chooses patience over conflict, there must be an ulterior motive hiding beneath the surface. To her, that assumption said more about society's expectations than it did about the people being questioned. She reflected on the long road that had brought her to this point in her career. Success hadn't arrived overnight. There had been years of performing in small venues, long drives between comedy clubs, and countless moments when very few people knew her name. Throughout those years, she said, she had encountered criticism, disappointment, rejection, and setbacks, experiences familiar to almost every entertainer trying to build a career. Yet through all of it, she had made one decision she never wanted to compromise. She refused to believe that success required becoming cynical. According to Leanne, remaining respectful wasn't a performance for audiences or television cameras. It was simply the way she believed people should treat one another, regardless of whether anyone was watching. The audience listened without interruption. For much of the interview, People had been reacting with laughter, applause, or occasional surprise. Now, many simply watched in silence, fully engaged in what had become a conversation about values rather than entertainment. Andy reportedly attempted to lighten the mood once again. He steered the discussion back toward humor, suggesting that everyone was simply having an honest conversation and that there was no reason for the exchange to feel so serious. But by then, the emotional weight of the moment had become impossible to ignore. Leanne acknowledged that difficult conversations are part of public life. She wasn't asking to be protected from challenging questions. She wasn't suggesting that interviewers should avoid uncomfortable topics altogether. Her concern was different. She questioned whether entertainment had reached a point where genuine kindness was treated as something suspicious simply because it didn't create dramatic television. She wondered why audiences had become so accustomed to arguments, scandals, and public confrontations that calm sincerity now seemed almost unbelievable. Those words appeared to resonate with many people watching. Whether viewers agreed with every point she made or not, it was difficult to overlook the consistency of her message. From the moment she walked onto the set until this very point in the conversation, she had remained exactly the same person, measured, respectful, and unwilling to attack anyone personally. That consistency strengthened her position. Rather than responding emotionally to increasing pressure, she continued answering with composure. Ironically, the more composed she became, the more the contrast between the two styles of communication stood out. The conversation had evolved into something much larger than a disagreement between a host and a guest. It had become a discussion about the way public conversations are conducted, the expectations placed on celebrities, and whether honesty must always be accompanied by conflict to be considered genuine. By this stage, everyone seemed to realize the interview had crossed an invisible line. Returning to harmless jokes and light conversation no longer felt possible. Something significant had shifted. And although neither side appeared willing to completely abandon their position, it was becoming increasingly clear that the evening was approaching its final and most unforgettable moment. The decision that followed wouldn't just determine how the interview ended. It would determine how the entire conversation would be remembered. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The conversation had reached a place where another clever joke wasn't going to fix the mood, and another carefully worded question wasn't going to change anyone's mind. The audience could feel it. What had started as a cheerful celebrity interview had slowly transformed into something far more serious, and now everyone seemed to be waiting for one person to decide what happened next. That person was Leanne Morgan. She reportedly sat quietly for a brief moment, taking a slow breath before looking back toward Andy Cohen. There was no anger on her face, no visible frustration. If anything, she appeared almost disappointed. When she finally spoke again, her voice remained calm. She explained that she had accepted the invitation because she genuinely believed it would be a fun evening. She had looked forward to sharing stories, laughing with the audience, and celebrating the projects she had worked so hard to build. Instead, she felt as though the conversation had gradually become less about her work and more about challenging who she was as a person. The room remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Even those who had been reacting throughout the interview now seemed content simply to listen. Leanne continued by saying that there comes a point when every conversation reaches a crossroads. One path leads toward understanding. The other leads toward proving someone wrong. In her view, the interview had slowly drifted toward the second path, and she no longer believed continuing it would accomplish anything meaningful. Andy reportedly attempted to ease the tension. He suggested that spirited conversations sometimes become uncomfortable and that there was no reason for the evening to end on such a serious note. He encouraged everyone to move forward and return to the lighter atmosphere that had defined the beginning of the interview. But this time, Leanne didn't seem convinced. She smiled politely before responding. She explained that moving forward only works when both people are actually willing to leave the disagreement behind. Otherwise, pretending everything is fine simply avoids the real issue rather than resolving it. Those words seemed to settle over the audience. There was no applause, no reaction, only complete attention. Leanne then reflected on the responsibility that comes with being in front of millions of viewers. Public conversations, she suggested, shape the way people treat one another. If every disagreement becomes entertainment and every act of kindness becomes something to question, eventually people begin expecting conflict everywhere they look. She said she didn't want to contribute to that. Her goal had never been to win an argument. It had never been to embarrass anyone. She simply wanted to remain true to the values that had guided her throughout her life and career. After another brief pause, she reportedly reached for her belongings. The movement itself was quiet and unhurried. For a moment, many people in the audience weren't even sure what was happening. Some assumed she was adjusting her chair or preparing for the next segment. Then she slowly stood. A wave of uncertainty spread through the room. Andy appeared surprised, reportedly asking if she was really leaving before the interview had concluded. His tone was noticeably different from earlier in the evening. The confidence that had characterized much of the discussion seemed to give way to genuine uncertainty. Leanne responded respectfully. She explained that she wasn't leaving because she was angry. She wasn't leaving to create headlines. And she certainly wasn't leaving to make a dramatic statement. She was leaving because she believed some conversations eventually reach a point where continuing them no longer serves either person involved. According to her, knowing when to step away can sometimes require more respect than knowing how to keep arguing. Those words seemed to linger in the studio. For several moments, nobody moved. The audience watched as Leanne reportedly thanked everyone for their time, offered a courteous farewell, and turned toward the exit with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the evening. There was no slammed door, no shouting, no emotional outburst, just a quiet decision made with confidence. That perhaps made the moment even more powerful. As she walked away, the contrast between the beginning and the end of the interview became impossible to ignore. Hours earlier, she had entered the studio smiling, expecting an evening of laughter and conversation. Now she was leaving in complete silence. Andy remained at his seat, appearing to process everything that had just unfolded. For the first time all night, there seemed to be no immediate response, no witty comeback, and no obvious way to guide the conversation back to familiar territory. The interview had reached its conclusion, but the silence that followed spoke louder than anything either of them had said. And although the cameras were still rolling, everyone watching seemed to understand that the evening had already produced the moment people would remember long after the broadcast was over. The moment Leanne Morgan reportedly disappeared from the set, the atmosphere inside the studio changed completely. Just minutes earlier, the room had been filled with conversation, laughter, and the familiar rhythm that longtime viewers associated with Watch What Happens Live. Now, that energy had vanished almost instantly, replaced by a silence so noticeable that it seemed to catch everyone off guard. No one appeared to know what would happen next. The audience remained seated, looking from the empty space where Leanne had been sitting back toward Andy Cohen. Some seemed confused. Others appeared surprised by how quickly the evening had unraveled. Whatever expectations people had when the interview began, this certainly hadn't been one of them. Andy reportedly stayed in his chair for a few moments without speaking. Throughout his career, he had built a reputation for handling unpredictable television. Awkward moments, unexpected comments, emotional interviews. He had experienced all of them before. Yet this situation appeared different. For the first time that evening, there seemed to be no obvious way to restore the mood. The usual humor didn't fit. Changing the subject felt impossible. Pretending nothing had happened wasn't an option. The contrast with the beginning of the interview couldn't have been greater. Only a short time earlier, the conversation had revolved around comedy, career milestones, and lighthearted stories. Now, the discussion everyone would remember had little to do with entertainment at all. Instead, it had become a debate about authenticity, respect, and the limits of confrontational interviewing. The audience seemed to recognize that shift immediately. Rather than applauding or reacting loudly, many simply remained quiet, reflecting on everything they had just witnessed. It was the kind of silence that often follows an unexpectedly serious conversation, when people are still deciding what they think before expressing an opinion. Andy reportedly attempted to gather himself. He acknowledged that interviews sometimes take unexpected turns and suggested that live television has always carried an element of unpredictability. It was a measured response, but even those words seemed unable to erase the tension that still lingered throughout the studio. By then, however, the interview itself was no longer the biggest story. The way it had ended had become the story. Within moments, viewers began discussing what had happened. Some believed Andy had simply been doing what interviewers are expected to do, asking challenging questions and encouraging honest conversation. Others felt the discussion had gradually crossed a line, shifting away from curiosity and toward unnecessary confrontation. The reactions were immediate. Supporters of Leanne praised the calm, respectful manner in which she had handled increasing pressure. They argued that she had remained consistent from beginning to end, refusing to compromise her principles even when the conversation became uncomfortable. At the same time, others defended Andy's interviewing style, pointing out that difficult questions have long been part of his approach and that celebrity interviews often involve moments of tension. As a result, the debate quickly expanded beyond the interview itself. People weren't simply discussing who had won the exchange. They were asking a much larger question. Where is the line between honest journalism and creating conflict for entertainment? Can an interviewer continue pressing a guest without risking the conversation itself? And when a guest chooses to leave rather than continue, should that decision be viewed as avoiding difficult questions or as setting personal boundaries? Those questions continued circulating long after the interview reportedly ended. Regardless of where viewers stood, one fact remained undeniable. The evening had become memorable for reasons no one had anticipated. Instead of another routine promotional appearance, the interview had sparked a broader conversation about media, celebrity culture, and the expectations placed on both hosts and guests. Sometimes the loudest television moments come from shouting. Other times, they come from complete silence. In this case, it wasn't the arguments people remembered most. It was the quiet that followed them. And that silence ensured the interview would continue being discussed long after the studio lights had dimmed. In the days that followed, the reported confrontation became far more than just another celebrity interview. People weren't only talking about what had been said. They were talking about what the exchange seemed to represent. At its core, the conversation appeared to highlight two very different approaches to communication. On one side was a television host whose career had been built on asking difficult questions, challenging guests, and creating memorable moments that audiences would continue discussing long after the cameras stopped rolling. For years, that formula had worked. Countless interviews had produced shocking confessions, emotional reactions, and headlines that dominated entertainment news. On the other side was a comedian whose entire public image had been built on something much quieter. Kindness, patience, respect. Rather than relying on controversy to keep people's attention, Leanne Morgan had earned her audience by telling relatable stories, finding humor in everyday life, and treating people with warmth both on and off the stage. Whether someone agreed with her perspective or not, those qualities had become closely associated with her career. The reported interview placed those two worlds directly in front of each other. One approach suggested that pushing harder eventually reveals the truth. The other suggested that honesty doesn't become more authentic simply because it's repeated under greater pressure. That contrast is likely one reason the conversation resonated with so many viewers. It wasn't just about one interview. It became a discussion about what audiences expect from public conversations in general. In today's media landscape, dramatic moments often spread faster than thoughtful ones. Heated arguments generate headlines. Emotional confrontations dominate social media. Short clips of tense exchanges frequently travel farther than calm, measured discussions. As a result, many people have begun asking whether conflict has become the default expectation whenever public figures sit down for an interview. If someone remains calm, are they seen as genuine? Or are they immediately suspected of hiding something? That question seemed to sit at the heart of the reported exchange. Leanne's responses, as described throughout the evening, consistently returned to the same idea. A person's character shouldn't have to be proven through confrontation alone. She appeared to believe that consistency speaks louder than dramatic reactions, and that remaining respectful under pressure is every bit as revealing as losing one's temper. Others, however, viewed the situation differently. Supporters of Andy Cohen argued that interviewers have a responsibility to ask questions that move beyond rehearsed talking points. Public figures often appear on television to promote projects, and many viewers appreciate hosts who challenge guests instead of allowing every conversation to remain predictable. From that perspective, difficult questions aren't necessarily unfair. They're part of the job. That difference in opinion explains why the reported interview generated such varied reactions. Some viewers admired Leanne's composure. Others defended Andy's persistence. Many simply appreciated watching two experienced professionals stand by their principles without the conversation descending into shouting or personal insults. Perhaps that's what made the moment feel so unusual. Despite the tension, neither side reportedly relied on dramatic outbursts to make their point. There were no raised voices echoing through the studio. No explosive confrontation that instantly ended the discussion. Instead, the disagreement unfolded through carefully chosen words, long pauses, and two people refusing to abandon what they believed. Ironically, that restraint may have made the exchange even more memorable. Sometimes the most powerful moments aren't created by the loudest voices. They're created by the people who remain calm when everyone expects them to lose control. Whether viewers ultimately agreed with Andy Cohen, Leanne Morgan, or somewhere in between, the reported interview reminded people of something important. The most meaningful conversations aren't always the ones where someone wins. Sometimes they're the ones that leave everyone still thinking long after they've ended. And perhaps that's why this interview continued generating discussion well beyond the studio itself. It wasn't simply remembered because two well-known personalities disagreed. It was remembered because it raised larger questions about authenticity, respect, and the way modern interviews balance entertainment with genuine conversation. Long after the lights faded and the audience went home, those questions remained. And for many viewers, they were far more interesting than the disagreement that started them in the first place. As the conversation surrounding the reported interview continued, one thing became increasingly clear. People weren't just replaying the final moments or debating who had the stronger argument. They were reflecting on how quickly an ordinary television appearance had transformed into something much more meaningful. When the interview began, expectations were simple. A popular comedian would promote her latest work. A seasoned television host would ask entertaining questions. The audience would laugh, enjoy the conversation, and move on to the next episode. Instead, the evening reportedly became a reminder that live interviews can take unexpected turns when two people approach the same conversation from completely different perspectives. For Andy Cohen, challenging questions have long been part of his interviewing style. His willingness to push beyond comfortable answers is one of the reasons viewers tune in. Many memorable television moments have come from that approach, and it's understandable why audiences often expect him to keep pressing until he uncovers something new. For Leanne Morgan, however, the reported interview appeared to reinforce a different belief. That authenticity doesn't require conflict. That kindness doesn't need to be defended. And that walking away from a conversation can sometimes communicate more than continuing to argue. Whether someone agreed with those ideas or not, they became the lasting impression many viewers took from the evening. Perhaps that's why the reported exchange resonated so strongly. It wasn't built around dramatic shouting. It wasn't driven by insults or personal attacks. Instead, it unfolded through calm words, thoughtful responses, and two people standing firmly behind what they believed. In an era where so many public disagreements quickly become louder and more hostile, the reported interview stood out for a different reason. Its defining moments came through restraint. The pauses, the careful choice of words, the refusal to abandon personal principles, even as the pressure continued to build. Sometimes those moments leave the deepest impression. They encourage people to look beyond the headlines and think about the larger issues underneath the story. What should audiences expect from celebrity interviews? Where should the line be drawn between honest questioning and unnecessary confrontation? Can a conversation remain engaging without becoming combative? And when someone decides to end an interview rather than continue a disagreement, should that decision be viewed as weakness or as confidence in their own boundaries? There are no simple answers. That's why conversations like this continue long after the cameras stop rolling. Regardless of which perspective viewers found more convincing, one thing is difficult to ignore. The reported interview became memorable not because it followed the usual formula, but because it broke away from it. It challenged expectations. It sparked discussion. And it reminded audiences that sometimes the most unforgettable television moments are the ones no one planned. Of course, it's important to remember that reports and online discussions about celebrity interviews can differ from what actually happened, and public reactions often reflect personal opinions as much as confirmed facts. In the end, only the people who were part of that conversation know exactly what they were thinking in those final moments. Everyone else is left to interpret what they saw and decide for themselves. Was this simply a difficult interview that took an unexpected turn? Did both sides genuinely believe they were defending the right approach? Or does the story reveal something larger about the way modern entertainment, media, and public conversations have evolved? Those are questions every viewer will answer differently. But one thing is certain. Long after the studio lights faded and the conversation ended, people were still talking about it. And perhaps that's the clearest sign that, whatever truly happened that night, it became far more than just another celebrity interview.